Oh my gosh, how amazing is this place? Four Seasons, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. How was your day today? WeCon is on a different level, is it not? For those that have been here before. Thank you, Amani and Susie and Shelly, for taking it to a new level. Good luck in 2021,
sure.
everyone.
Although I'm like,
so we are in for such a special treat. I mean, it started with this arrival here to Four Seasons, and we could not do this without them, and also with our partners at CAA. If you were at our October program, you got to experience one of their speakers then, and we're so excited to expand on the partnership and bring another one here today. And it's going to be awesome. So Mr. Amani Roberts, our VP of Education, is going to be having a little fireside chat with Meena Harris. Meena is a commissioner on the San Francisco Commission on the Status of Women, the head of strategy and leadership at Uber, where she oversees transformation initiatives across business units to positively impact brand, customer loyalty, and employee engagement. Previously, she was a data privacy and cybersecurity attorney at a major global law firm. Last year, Meena launched the Phenomenal Women Action Campaign, which is a women-powered civic engagement platform. I'd like to now bring to the stage Amani Roberts and Meena Harris.
Yes, the one. There you are. Hello.
oh, thanks.
Yes,
I'm on slide, so very comfy.
All right. So, here we are. Welcome.
Thank
on behalf of
you.
our chapter, welcome. We're excited to talk with you. We're going to have a quick kind of fireside chat.
With the real fire.
Yes, with a real fire. And then after about 30 minutes, we'll get some Q&A from the audience. So get your questions down. We'll run a microphone around, ask you questions. And we're just super excited. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So we'll kind of start off just getting to know you a little bit. You've lived in Boston, you're from Oakland, and you lived in Washington, D.C. What area is your favorite and why?
Bay Area is home, so that's always going to be my favorite and where my heart is. But DC holds a very special place in my heart for a very specific period of time.
Okay.
I was a baby lawyer. It's where I went right after law school. It was during the golden Obama years. I was on the campaign in 2008, and I had a bunch of friends that went straight from the campaign into the White House. Yeah! So I went off to law school. All my friends were in administration, and then I later went to DC to practice law. So it was a very formative time for me, and it was just like, it was so fun, right? It was all of my best friends from the campaign in this one little city. And I say that as I've gotten older, it started to feel like a little like high school, you know? So it was that specific moment in time. So I miss DC in that way. And then New York. I was back and forth between DC and New York, and oh my God, I miss New York so much. The food, the warm summers. So I kind of compartmentalized it. It was pre-kids.
Okay.
And now we're back in San Francisco with the two little girls, and so it's just a different kind of lifestyle.
Okay.
Yeah.
You failed to mention the cold winters. Do you not like them, or?
Well, so the thing is, everybody, you guys are SoCal people, so you get to enjoy like actual sunshine and warmth. People think that San Francisco and the Bay Area is like East Coast people, right? Think that it's warm and sunny, and it's not.
Right.
So yeah, the cold is kind of like, it's cold every day in San Francisco.
Yes.
I've learned to tolerate it. So.
Good. Well, since you know, as a DC native, I'm really happy that it holds a special place in your heart.
It really
I'm happy
does.
you said that.
Yeah.
In your title for Uber is the word leadership. So I want to start off by asking you, what is your definition of leadership?
That's a hard one. It's a big question. I think my definition of leadership is courage, which means the courage to speak up, the courage to have big ideas, the courage to inspire others with innovative ideas, but I think it has to also be followed by action. So I think it's this combination of courage with action. And I think, you know, I've been able to look at the concept of leadership from so many different angles, right? Both in terms of my time right now and the corporate atmosphere, as well as in politics, as well as in, you know, the nonprofit space and the work that I do with Phenomenal Women. And I think that there's another element too, which is really about followership, right? Which, as I conceive of that, it's more coming from my political side, which is sort of, it's community organizing, right? How do you get people to follow you and to sign on to your big, bold idea, or to sign on to think that they can, you know, accomplish what you're challenging them to accomplish, and having the courage to inspire people to do. So I think it's the combination of those two things.
Okay. You mentioned courage. One would say it took a lot of courage to take your current position at Uber, knowing the issues that it was dealing with before you got there with culture. Explain to us your thought process in accepting this opportunity.
Yeah, I did not necessarily think of it as courageous, maybe more like crazy, which is what, some people were like, well, you're doing what?
Right.
I think part of it is, I'm trained as a lawyer and spent a lot of time practicing law, and I think I'm just sort of conditioned to run to hard problems and to run to the fire. And I definitely came to the company at a time when we were experiencing a lot of issues. I had a very interesting experience with it in that I had done a partnership with Uber before I went to work there, which is what led to them recruiting me. And so I was able to see it from both sides. And what was really interesting, and the partnership was with my women's brand, Phenomenal Woman. And at the time, this was back in 2017, I had people that said, oh my God, what are you doing? How could you partner with Uber, right? And my response as an outsider back then was seeing, what was going on in terms of the culture issues, and specifically issues that were affecting women, was that you can't throw your hands up and run away, right? If anything, the women in the company and our company now needed that support that we were able to provide through my company more than anyone, right? And I saw that there was a lot of sort of, folks were pulling out of partnerships or saying, we can't work with you. And I thought, well, what about all the women that are still at the company, right? They're still there. We need to, actually engage with them. So that was my perspective on the outside. And as I really, got to know the company better and was doing this partnership, I really was inspired by the employees and seeing how committed people were and how they wanted it to be better. It was right when we were doing a pilot around an executive education program. Right. And one of the first things, I was actually doing events with a lot of event professionals at Uber, right? We were hosting these pop-up events all across the country at offices. And so this is, an employee on the events team said, oh my God, we have an executive education course. I'm going to take all 6 of them. I'm so excited. And it was just, people, and it wasn't because I had a low standard for Uber, right? We did a tech tour with companies all across the valley, but it really stood out in that way. And I was in conversations with them, I had, friends, both who had worked there and who were currently there, that said that it was really a culture of entrepreneurship at its core, right? And I think that there's a question of, when you're moving too fast, right? And you don't sort of take the time to take stock of what the effects of moving too fast are. Right. And I think we talk about that a lot, but that was really appealing to me, right? To be in an environment where I could go in, if I had an interesting idea, that I could go do it. And really kind of cultivating that culture of entrepreneurship. But again, and the way that our CEO has talked about it is it's about, are we being responsible, right? Sure. I think tech, I worked at Facebook early on, and the motto at that time, I don't think it is anymore, was move fast and break things. Right. Right? And that obviously can lead to some bad culture, dynamics. And the point is that it's not just about how women are treated, it's about helping managers to manage, which was really the source of a lot of those issues, right? We had, the percentage is staggering, but it was a huge percentage of managers were first-time managers, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't know how to deal with some of these issues. So anyway, I mean, it's complicated stuff, right? And I think that from the outside, having done this partnership through the lens of it's a women's empowerment brand, right? And really thinking about, well, what can I do to be creative to engage these employees so that they can feel seen and feel supported, even in the smallest way, right? Through a T-shirt and through, a reception where we were cultivating that sort of, engagement among female employees. So that's why I went, and it was, as I said, it was right in the middle of sort of all this stuff happening. There's never a dull moment. It's still that way, right? But I think part of it too is, it's still a startup, right? And those sorts of environments, again, I think when you talk about culture issues, you really do have to step back, right? And I think in Silicon Valley especially, we're so accustomed to viewing everything from the lens of a product launch, right? And it's very almost, clinical, and you put the thing out there and it's a success, and then you go to the next thing, right? And there's also this sort of sense of immediate gratification, I think. And the point is, you can be as creative as you want to be and really come at this with a fresh perspective, but it's hard stuff that takes a while. And so I think coming to it from my sort of boring lawyer perspective of understanding that dynamic, and then also from the brand perspective, right, about how do we be more creative about these things and not just do the unconscious bias trainings. That's important for sure, but there are other ways that we can really be doing interesting things that go to employee engagement, which, a lot of it's doing events, right, and thinking about creative ways of bringing out different narratives and dialogues and conversations with our employees.
Absolutely. Now, as you kind of reflect back on your time at Uber, What are some of the most valuable leadership lessons you've learned that would apply to our industry in terms of the meeting and events industry?
So I talked just now, I think about being creative and being bold, right? I think for the events industry, you have enormous impact in terms of people's literal experiences, right? And the way that they consume information and content and experiences and conversations. And I think that in terms of leadership, it's really about being bold, thinking about who are, and when we talk about diversity and inclusion as well, who are the voices that are not usually at the table that you can use your platform and your influence to bring them in, to expose them to your audience, right? Who are sort of, rising star voices or non-traditional voices. I think somebody tweeted about this fairly recently, and it was interesting, which was like, stop asking the same people to do panels all the time, right? It's a normal thing. It's sort of like you see people doing it, you're like, they must be good, they're trendy, like we want to get them, they're in high demand. But the fact of the matter is, and this again goes to kind of basic principles around D&I, which is that there's a lot of talent out there, right? There's a lot of amazing people, and it's really up to each of us to be thinking, I think, intentionally and thoughtfully about how do I use my position of power and influence to be able to give that person an opportunity. And again, have the same amazing outcomes, right? That you have a really dynamic conversation or a really interesting expert perspective, but are really taking that approach of leadership, right? To say, it's incumbent upon me to bring this perspective to this, because if I don't do it, it probably won't happen.
No.
Right?
Right. Good. And then where do you see Uber in the future? Like, what's next? What's coming next? What can you share with us?
I think, we're still actively working on a lot of the basics, right? And so in terms of, we've been talking a lot about D&I, but things like, sponsorship programs, right? Thinking about from the perspective of, not just looking at the data, not just thinking about the pipeline, but also how do you get people to stay? How do you get them to feel engaged? How do you retain them? How do you, better yet, promote them? How do we think about, the whole sort of life cycle? And I think that's one of the things that I was really able to appreciate on the outside through this tech tour that we did for Phenomenal Woman, which was getting to engage with all kinds of different employees across a number of different tech companies and getting to see some of the common, issues that people experience. And a lot of it, frankly, is just kind of creating spaces through events, through, making these connections so that people can talk to each other, right? I think especially in tech, we operate as well in these silos.
Right.
And as much as, people have individual, very unique experiences within one place, it's often a shared universal experience. And that can extend to things like, new mothers coming back to the workplace, right? And I actually, had that experience myself I had taken leave at one tech company that I was at, and then Uber was the second place that I took parental leave. And realizing that one of the companies was not meeting sort of a basic standard of care for new moms, and I was able to then say, hey, did you realize that Twitter's doing this or Uber's doing that, and we could be doing better, right? So anyway, that's all to say that we're still working on a lot of the basic stuff. One of the, speaking of moms and parental leave, huge priorities for us is becoming one of the most radically caregiver inclusive cultures. And so really thinking about caregivers holistically and not just as parents, right? We know that people have elderly care, obligations. We know that in terms of, parents, that women and mothers are, I think it's something like 6 times more likely to take care of a sick child. And so really thinking about all these different experiences across different types of caregivers and making sure that we're building in, benefits and culture and, things like flexible work so that people can actually stay and do well and thrive. So that's just one example, or 2 examples, but again, it's the basic stuff. And I think the point too is that you have to stick with it, right? You said like, what's next? And it's like, we still got a lot of stuff to really still, get right. And we all do, right? It's a continuous process. And I don't think any of us are getting it perfect. And I think knowing that it's sort of a constant commitment to improvement is really important to keep in mind. Absolutely.
You've spoken about Phenomenal Woman a few times. What impact has creating Phenomenal Woman had on your life personally and professionally?
Oh man, personally, I'm tired. It's, It's, as I'm at Uber full time, it's, my, like, what do they call it? The night and weekends entrepreneur.
Your side
that's
hustle.
The life, my side hustle, exactly. As the kids say, my side hustle. And I have 2 kids also, literally, so it's just a lot at once. But it's incredibly, there's all this conversation around like self-care and, actually I did get a massage today. I would like
There you go,
right?
there you go.
And I was actually talking to somebody backstage about the fact that I was trying to potentially like rush out and get back home, and I was like, it's okay to just stay a night and not have to get woken up by the kids in the morning.
Stay with us a while, yes.
Right, that's okay to do. But really, these moments of getting to interact with just incredible women all across the country through this platform has been one of the most invigorating things ever. And it's my self-care, right? Like I'm really tired, but it's moments like that. It's being in rooms like this, getting to meet people who are just so excited about the work that they're doing, thinking about how they can make the world better from their own sphere of influence, right? And so I kind of considered myself someone who's fairly knowledgeable about sort of who's doing cool stuff in the world, and I feel like each day I find out about somebody new who's just doing something else extraordinary that I did not know about. And so that's just been one of the most incredible aspects of it, and getting to learn from these women, right? I think another piece of it, I'll categorize that as sort of like extraordinary women, right? But there's also this whole group of like ordinary women. That's part of what our whole sort of motto and approach is, which is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and getting to connect with different communities and learn about sort of what people care about and how they want to get up in the morning and impact the world. And they're, again, going about their ordinary lives. Everybody has a 9 to 5 or kids to feed and busy things to do, but there's a way that each of us can be engaging. And so getting to see that excitement, and I think we're in an era right now, I think, in terms of really heightened political activism and engagement. And so you're seeing a lot more of that, but it's just been extraordinary to really understand the true power of individual, ordinary people, and people who really want to do something, right? Do anything. Even if it's not their full-time job, even if it's not, I think, there's this really important, I think, great conversation around encouraging women to run for office, and I absolutely think that more women need to run for office, more women need to get elected, but I think it's also, about having a real conversation that's not like reasonable necessarily for regular women, right? That's a huge risk and a big leap to do that, right? And I think there's some kind of, and I think sometimes the conversation is like, oh, just to go run for city council. It's like, that's a really big thing to do, right? And that there are other ways that we can be engaging, men and women, right? A big thing at Uber that we're looking at is male allyship. How do we really bring men into this conversation in an equal way and not just consider some of this stuff women's issues, right? It's all of our issues. So it's just each day, as I guess I should step back and say, I never intended to do, this was never supposed to be a thing. Phenomenal Woman was my own, example of me getting up after the election in 2016 and saying like, wow, what can I do? I need to do something. It was supposed to be a 1-month-long fundraising campaign to raise money for women's organizations. This was now almost 3 years ago. I never thought I would, be here sitting on a stage still talking about it. But I saw the need for it. I saw that it was really filling something for people in that moment. And I stuck with it, right? And here we are. We're still here.
Yes.
And each day it still brings something new, both with the campaign as well as my work at Uber.
Good. So congrats on that success and continued success.
Thank you.
Speaking of sticking with it, you have previously said that diversity and inclusion takes a lot of work. It's difficult, it's frustrating. It's something you have to stick with for the long term. How do you stay resilient with regards to diversity and ensure that tough times don't cause you to lose passion about this topic?
Wine. I know that I'm the only thing. People are already drinking.
Yes.
I knew you guys are the fun people.
Yes,
let's
we
be
are.
honest, right? You guys are the fun people. Jokes aside, I know that I'm like the last person between you and the reception, right, and happy hour. But I think part of it is literally reminding myself of that. I spoke earlier about how in tech there's this kind of atmosphere of like move fast and break things and immediate gratification. And the fact is, this is really hard work, and it's not this sort of black and white issue of, data is important, but it's really about like really hard culture shift, paradigm shift work. And for some issues, I mean, that's like generational change, right? And we're talking about real systemic change. And I know that sounds just sort of like big, but it is. And that's kind of the point that I have to remind myself in that way as well to celebrate the victories when we see them, right? And celebrate the wins, no matter how small, no matter how incremental. So I think it's kind of twofold, reminding myself that like this is hard, it takes a long time, you got to stick with it, keep your eye on the ball. But then again, and that sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Even in the most basic sense of at a startup, right, where you have a lot of org change, right? So one org is sort of getting their stuff together, you're doing really well, and then a leader leaves, or there's a shift, right? And that's part of needing to adapt and not say, oh my God, everything I put in is just, falling apart, but say, okay, how do we see this through for the next 5 years, right? Not just from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. So that's part of it. I think, it's also recognizing on the topic of self-care that, take a step back when you need to. I think that it can be very emotionally draining work. And I would also say that it's not for everybody, right? A parallel for me would be, I practiced family law as a pro bono attorney for a year while I was in DC, and every day I came home and I was just like, this is really hard stuff, and I ultimately determined that that it was not for me. Like I couldn't emotionally deal with that. So I think it's also just being, real that it's sort of not for everybody. But to that point, make sure that you're hiring people who are able to, see the long game and stick with it and are really deeply passionate about it, right? I think you have to really, really care about this stuff to be able to stick with it. And again, that's no judgment to people who it's not sort of like your main passion, but it's important stuff. And as I said, it's long-term culture shift, not just, do we have X% more, employees of color? Are we getting X% more of speakers of color on our panels? Are we actually engaging in dialogue and really pushing this forward in a meaningful way? Which is also to say that you have to integrate it, right? I think there's a kind of narrow view that D&I sits in D&I, and that it's about the data, it's about the pipeline. But I think, again, back to what I was saying earlier, even in the work that you all are doing, you can be having that top of mind, right? As I'm planning an event, am I thinking about the diversity in my speakers? Am I thinking about the diversity in my vendors, right? Am I thinking about the diversity and sort of the topics that we are engaging with? And so, again, I think it's on all of us, but it's not easy stuff, and you really have to be intentional if you want to see real change in the short term and the long term.
Definitely. Now we're going to go back to when you were first working at early age startups, because you were kind of early on, like when they say they like to work fast and break things. So what do you think, when you think back, were some of the most valuable lessons that you learned from your time with early stage startups?
I hope I don't sound like a broken record, but it's sort of, it follows up on what I just said, which is be intentional at the very beginning. Like, set your values early and stick with them and bake them into every single thing that you do, right? That was one of my biggest lessons, and I've seen both the ways that can have positive outcomes and where if you don't do that, it can have negative outcomes. And I would point to Slack. Are people familiar with Slack?
Yes.
Do you guys use Slack?
Yes,
awesome.
we do.
So when I left the practice of law, when I was living my East Coast life and I came back to tech, I worked at Slack. And that was something that really stood out for me at that company, which is not only was that tone and that priority set from the top, from the CEO, saying, this is one of the #1 things that I'm committed to and that you are going to hold me accountable for and that you're going to see permeate everything in my company, right? Which is diversity. And it's actually something, I mean, to the point of how this is good for a company, it's something that actually influenced me to want to work there, because I saw it from the outside and said, oh, they're doing good stuff. They really are committed to this stuff. But the point too is that they set the tone, they set the priority, and they stuck with it, and they did it early, and they had the opportunity to do it early, right? Because it was a small company at that time, and baked it into everything they did. It's this concept of diversity by design. In cybersecurity world, it's like privacy by design, right? It cannot be an afterthought. So I think, and this maps onto what I was saying about Uber too, right? There was this incredible culture of entrepreneurship, and there still is, but there were moments where it got out of control, right? Because there wasn't this kind of thoughtfulness about, okay, what does that really mean? What are the values that we are putting behind this concept of, having an entrepreneurial culture? So I think that's a huge one. Another is that your people are your most valuable asset.
Yes.
And if you don't invest in your people, you are not investing in your company. And again, I think in tech, we're just so used to just like running through things, and the point is the same with the diversity stuff, which is it may feel like it takes longer, right? Or it may feel like it's slowing you down, but it's an investment for the long term, and it pays dividends and it pays off. I think I hear that often, right? I'm sure all of you have as well, which is, we have a lot of white guys on our team and we really need to hire, a person of color or woman, and but we got to do it in a month. Like we really got to get this position filled. And there's been many times where I'm like, do you really? Like, is it really that? Like, can you wait? Can you do it in 3 months, right? Can you really take time? 6 months? I've seen positions stay open, and it's sometimes you got to work around that and figure out how to fill that gap in the meantime for a year, right? But it's worth waiting for and worth, really investing in people that are going to serve those values and that purpose. So I think it's, again, just playing the long game and being intentional. I think we all get kind of wrapped up in execution and getting the product out the door, getting the event, done and successful. But I think it behooves all of us to really think about how do we step back and really think about the long game, including with our people.
Agreed. I want to continue with talking about apps such as Slack. What digital platform do you feel has the potential to be the genesis of the next worldwide movement?
Oh my God. I mean, I am sorry. I'm triggered because I think, as I said, I worked at Facebook, and I don't know the answer to that other than I think that it is still social media. And I think that we are in this moment where we are seeing how powerful it is, and for both good and bad, and the ability to use it for, I think it already has contributed and been a catalyst for movements across the world. And I think we're seeing right now how that it can happen, but also if we are not, again, careful and, thinking about things like privacy from, day one, that it can be vulnerable to, in this case, foreign interference, and how that can really distort and really mess things up. So, I think that it's still social media.
Okay.
I think that it'll shift and change and evolve, and you've seen sort of from Facebook to Instagram, which of course our Instagram is owned by Facebook, to be clear. And with Twitter, I think is an interesting one as well, where I think there's been a lot more engagement with Twitter, both for people wanting to consume information and news, and then also, again, we're in this sort of era of heightened activism, people wanting to use that to speak out, and you've seen it catalyze movements, starting with, for example, Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, right? And that was how many years ago now, right? Like, we're still in this. So I don't have a good answer other than we got to figure out what we're doing right now with this very powerful tool.
It is. Well, I appreciate you answering as well. I'm going to ask you a question I love to ask people that I interview because I think it just shows a lot of wisdom. When you were 21, you were still at Stanford, right? So we're going to go back and talk to 21-year-old Meena.
I just graduated.
You just graduated, so you're getting ready to leave. And we're going to give yourself, younger self, advice based on what you know now. What advice would you give your younger self?
I think it would be like, stop worrying, and life is long. You will have many years to figure out like what you want to do in the world, and don't worry about it. I think I was so wrapped up in like, who am I going to be, and where, and what am I going to do in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years, and I think it's important to have some idea and try to map it out. But at the end of the day, what I have learned from mentors and folks that I admire and people that I see in the world, like you can only plan so much, and one of the biggest lessons I think that I started to learn in law school, and frankly that I think I've only really come to understand through Phenomenal Woman and being an entrepreneur, is that like it's okay to get off the treadmill, right? And it's okay to close doors. I think, again, and part of it is I'm creative, right? I had all these interests and I sort of didn't know which way I wanted to go, and I was sort of wrapped up in checking the boxes and doing what I thought was like the prestigious thing. And ultimately, where I am now is exactly where I could have like guessed that I would be. I was always creative. I was always entrepreneurial. But it took me. I'm 35 when I'm 36. I just figured this out like 3 years ago, right? And so in that way too, just to be kind to yourself and know that, again, this kind of goes to the point about phenomenal women and ordinary people being able to do these things, which is, even if it's not your full-time job, like keep up with your passions, right? On the weekends and during evenings, stay curious in pursuing those things, and it all kind of works out, you know? If you put your head down and you do good work and you commit to that at the very least, I think that it all kind of works out. But as I said, I mean, I think on my kind of entrepreneurial, professional career journey, I feel like only in the last 3 years I felt sort of that exhale of like, okay, I can step off the treadmill. Like everything's gonna be okay. I actually don't know what I'm gonna be doing in 5 years. I don't know if Phenomenal Woman will still exist. And in part, I've been able to kind of shift that mindset because, again, it was never supposed to be anything to begin with. And I just kind of stuck with it and had faith in it and applied my passions and saw how people responded to it and thought about how can I keep it going, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, that was very
great.
long. I'm just sitting here talking to my 21-year-old self.
That's good. I'm sure she would appreciate it. But yeah, good. We're going to pause and take some questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We're going to run a microphone to you. And do we have any questions in the audience? So I have one up here, right here. So wait for the microphone. And then we'll get one in the back there.
In your experience, when you're in an organization that's very male-centric, and you notice a problem within the women community in your organization, what are the first steps you should do to bring awareness to the management team and how to solve it?
I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You said if you're in a company that is male-centric and you note a problem in the women's community, okay, and how do you bring that to leadership? I think, I spoke to this a little bit, which is that we're in these massive organizations. Often they're siloed from each other. Teams are siloed from each other oftentimes. And I think in those instances, it can be hard for one person to speak up and to feel like they have agency and power to do that. I think this goes to the whole point of good managers and making sure that people know who to talk to. But I think to the extent everybody's working through those issues and you do have a women's community through an ERG or some other way that folks are connected, I think part of it is about finding that connectivity and making sure that you are speaking about it within that community, right? So that you can sort of find strength in numbers and together bring that to leadership, right? I think part of that too is being able to say to leadership, I've talked to lots of different people and we've all sort of observed this or we've all been experiencing this and here are all the different ways we have across different, it's just a stronger argument to make and I think a more convincing one to really inspire somebody to take action. And I think it's also just something that's gonna be the catalyst to make people more likely to speak at all, to know that they can do it within a community of people that have their back and are engaged with the issue with the same sort of commitment, right? I think I spoke to my experience as a new mom, and it felt I would have been the first mom to go on maternity leave, and I ended up being like the second by some weird circumstance. And it was still very isolating. And I saw the first mom go through things, and I could kind of learn from that. And she had a pretty bad experience. But I also found myself thinking like, this doesn't feel right. I don't feel fully supported. But I didn't have anyone else to talk to, and in that way, I could have sort of taken that to management, and I believe that I would have been heard, but I also took time to talk to people at other companies and to say, what has been your experience? What are your accommodations? What should I, be presenting in terms of making my sort of case in a better way? So I always think about things from the lens of community organizing, right? And making, creating community and connectivity around issues like that. And again, every organization is different, but I think that a lot of it does come down to management and making sure that folks who are in management positions have the tools to be able to receive information like that and to engage with it and to know how to take it also to leadership.
Good. We had a question in the back there, I believe. You're right there.
Hi, how are you guys dealing with the AB5 law? And also, what can we, as people that love services like yours, can do to help support your vendors and employees?
I'm gonna be super annoying and decline to answer that question because it involves a legal matter and I am not on the legal team, so I'm sorry.
It's okay. All right, next question up here, and we have two right here, Beth, and then up here in the front. Right, wait for the microphone though.
Hi. Oh, stand up. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. So, who were your female role models beginning off in your career?
Oh, you said in my career, yeah.
Not even career, starting off.
In life.
I was gonna have a very easy, quick answer, which is my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt. I grew up in a somewhat unique household, which was that it was all women, all like really strong, amazing women. I've compared it to the like opening scene of Wonder Woman, where it's like this all-female sovereign island where like all these amazing women are running around like saving the world. As a child, like that's what it felt like to be in my household, and I could talk for hours about each of them and how incredible they are and the impact that they've had on me. But I was so lucky to grow up with that, and it was all I knew, right? I think we're now having these conversations about male allyship. I like the idea of men in power was like foreign to me, you know, and it's kind of awesome to grow up that way. And also I was able to, they were each doing things in the world in a different way, and so I was able, I do come from a family of lawyers, civil rights lawyers and, you know, public servants, but so that was sort of the commonality, but I was still able to see it from a different lens, and they nevertheless, you know, told me that I could be anything, that I could do anything, and they showed that to me, right? We talked earlier about leadership, and I say that I think it's really about courage followed with action, and they didn't just tell me that, they were showing it to me, they were doing it, you know, and I now as a mother myself feel so lucky and know how special that was to have been raised that way. Yeah.
Nice. Right here, yes.
Thank you so much for your time and for being here, and your aunt is awesome. Tell her we say
Thank
hey. So you come from a family of lawyers, you went to Harvard Law School, you were a lawyer, and then now you're head of strategy and leadership, which is HR, it's not law.
No, it is not. Praise the Lord.
How did you make such a vast career transition? Like, how do you prepare yourself for a role that isn't traditional in your background and your education, and like kind of obviously succeed and thrive in that? Like, how do you make that switch?
Yeah, I think, as I said, I spent a long time kind of checking the boxes of doing the traditional thing, and nevertheless knew that sort of the creative thing, the entrepreneurial thing was like in there. And I knew that, and I spent kind of time understanding that I still needed to build that kind of foundation for myself, right? Of going to law school, of doing the clerkship, and then going to the law firm, and I would not change a single thing about that. There are moments where I'm like, dang, should I have like done marketing? Should I have, you know, and I actually think that I would not change anything, but in the back of my head, I always knew, okay, I need to like get further and further away from this when I feel safe to do it. And it was really the Phenomenal Woman action campaign that kind of was that moment for me, where I knew that like this was the thing I needed to run to, and I just felt it. I know it sounds so cliche, right? But there's no question that it was a point at which I was kind of liberated to do that. I was financially stable. I felt like I had checked enough damn boxes where I was like, Meena, this is it, go do it, you know? And the point is I had other creative ideas before that some good ideas, some bad ideas, but I always joke that like not every good idea is worth quitting your job for. And in those moments didn't, right? I stayed at my law firm. I kept, you know, with that experience, knowing that was gonna be sort of foundational learning for me. The other thing I think though that is, you know, non-traditional as well, and was a learning experience for me, which is just recognizing when you may be in one of those moments to go run to that thing that you know you've been dying to do, right? Again, whether that for you means being financially stable or having other types of support, or feeling like you've done enough where you feel sort of like you have something good and you really want to execute on it. And the thing that's interesting about my position now is that it came out of, as much as I was like slowly trying to back away from the law and like knew that I didn't want to do that forever, my role came out of my entrepreneurial creative pursuit, right? And I could have never guessed that would happen. So I think that's also part of the lesson is just, as I said before, if you do identify some of those passions that may not be what you're currently doing full time, just to figure out how to stick with them. And you know, whether it's nights and weekends or once a month or taking a Photoshop class here, I'm speaking in creative terms, so that's sort of my perspective, but whatever that thing is, you know, stick with it, and you never know when sort of that moment will arise when you are sort of prepared and ready, right? And you may not know, you would have ever guessed that you would be ready in that moment. I'm gonna butcher this quote so badly, but it's something like, prepare yourself and work on yourself and develop yourself so that when that moment happens, like you're prepared for it, right? I messed that up so badly. It's an amazing quote. Somebody probably knows it. But you don't know what you're preparing for, but you know that you are chipping away at sort of what drives you, what makes you better, and hopefully that moment will strike. And I've heard people say that, before I did it, and I was like, that's so silly. Like, I'm doing doc review. When am I gonna go, do something creative, entrepreneurial? But it tends to work out if you stick with it.
Yeah. Many times, creatives such as ourselves will let fear get in the way of going for it. What advice would you give to someone who is like really scared to kind of go for it?
Oh man, like I'm a whine again. I think, I don't want to say something just so like lame, like get over your fears, but I think that is part of it. I think it's also like relying on your friends and network to kind of test it out and ask them if they think it's a good idea, right? Like put something out there and see how it does. I mean, I don't know if that applies necessarily in the event space. I'm trying to think about right? Like testing out sort of different event formats or speakers or venues or formats, right? And it may fail, but I think it's also about being overcoming fear to know that if you fail that it's okay and that you're only going to get better through that process. Again, it sounds so cliche, but it happens to me like almost on a daily basis where something does not go the way that I thought it absolutely had to go this way, and it didn't go that way, and I'm on a deadline and I'm so mad. And then, I got 2 extra days and I like made a totally different product and it was way better than the original one. And I'm like, oh great, I'm glad that my fulfillment center like messed that up because, so, again, it doesn't always work out that way, but I think that's part of it, right? Like being okay with understanding that it may not always work out, but that's also part of the process.
Absolutely. Question right here. Mr. Joe Martin has a question, and then I'll get you next, Lee. Yeah, okay, we got some time.
So we heard a lot about your past and all the accomplishments, and hear that you're 35 is super inspiring to me. So I want to hear what's next for you, like in your career goals. I mean, you've done so much. You've been at all these huge tech companies. You don't have to say you're going to leave Uber, but like, what's next for you, like career goal wise?
Man, I've become very comfortable with just like, I have no idea and I'm like so okay with that. But what I do know is I hope that it is continuing to build Phenomenal Woman in what I'm doing. I know that I'm not done and I have big dreams for it and I have a big vision for it. And I myself am working through some of this, right? How do I find the hours in the day? How do I find, do I want to get funding for it? Do I want to go down that path? Do I need more support? I think, so I am still consumed by some of that stuff, but I think I'm doing it. I think there's ultimately going to be a question again, right, of how big can it be, and what does it look like in 5 years? But I have become, again, as I said, through this sort of process on my entrepreneurial journey, have become so much more comfortable with not quite knowing, but still chipping away brick by brick at my vision and refining that. I mean, as I said, it was a 1-month thing. It was never supposed to be anything other than a 1-month fundraising campaign. And there have been really, I think, important moments for me. It's kind of just happening on like a once-a-year cadence now, where I sit down and I think about, like, what is this thing and what is it going to be next year, right? And how are you going to do that month, next month and in 3 months? And so, as I said, there is some planning that needs to happen, but I've also become so comfortable with just like knowing that's going to be okay. And, maybe the whole thing will crumble, I don't know, but I also know that like, I'm going to be fine. I'm at a point now where to be clear, I'm not about to refer to myself as Beyonce, but there's this like moment, I feel like it's like the Beyonce moment where it's like you just don't care. You've reached a certain point. I've checked enough boxes. For her, I feel like it was her Coachella performance, right? Where she like her mom said, don't do it, right? Like the audience is not gonna be into it. It's gonna, be bad for your, career that year. And she's like, I don't care. I'm Beyonce. Like I've reached a certain point where like I actually am just gonna put out into the world what I feel and what I'm passionate about. So I hope everyone in our lives can reach that Beyonce moment. I think we all aspire to be Beyonce, right? I think that's pretty relatable. So yeah, that's my like very fuzzy answer.
Good, good. Lee right here had a question, and then
Hello. In the spirit of a takeaway, given some of the culture of the company you're currently with and with the law background, is there a specific tactic or strategy that is your favorite to employ when you encounter resistance or limited thinking?
Interesting. I think that was kind of like a vague, I know what you may be getting at. Are you talking about from the perspective of leadership more so, or like as a manager?
Yeah,
okay.
On to kind of maybe more specifically with the company.
Yeah, you got it. We've definitely dealt with that in part, due to leadership changes, and I think that it really goes back to for one of the first questions you asked me, which is what it means to be a leader. And one of the things that I've learned at this company is that being a good leader can mean different things at different times in different contexts, right? And what it meant to be, and we talked about followership, right? And getting folks to sign on and to believe in what you're doing and to not be resistant to it. And I think that can take really different forms at different times. And so, for us, the moment when we did have a leadership change, I think it was very needed. And I think that the leader we brought on was the right person for that moment and provided that sort of clarity and just kind of adult in the room and right. But at the same time, I think that, it relates to the question that was asked earlier here, which is, how do you do this within a community that may sort of be pushing back? And I think it's about making individual connections and connecting people to talk about this stuff, right? I think that we have such a, in many ways, kind of detached clinical perspective on some of this stuff. And at the end of the day, it's people, right? A lot of it is just straight up like social psychology, like people stuff. And getting back to the basics of that, which in your case, maybe it's a workshop, maybe it's right, but like really tackling that head on with individuals and doing it person by person when you finally have sort of, a critical mass where you actually can influence leadership or an organization. But I think, again, it's not gonna happen overnight, especially if you're experiencing like really serious resistance. And it goes to the point of like culture shift, right? If you have a really toxic work environment where people take the approach of being resistant, you also have to dig deeper and understand why they're doing that. And it probably goes to something that's much deeper in terms of the dynamic on their team or something else that is not necessarily apparent to you as a manager, as somebody who's in higher leadership.
good, thank you. I think Tracy over here had a question.
I think it's really interesting how you talked about growing up in a woman-dominated household and with really strong women leaders in your family. And what I think is also interesting is how you walked into Uber in the wake of the Me Too movement when Uber was in the hot seat. And we've seen many benefits because of the Me Too movement, but what I'm really curious to know from you, growing up as such a strong woman with women leaders, is where do you think the Me Too movement has hurt us as women in leadership positions?
I do not think that the Me Too movement has hurt women in leadership positions. I think that's my short answer. I think that it is a very necessary moment that is encouraging. This goes to your question earlier about how do you have one person, feel comfortable speaking up, or that's sort of what I gathered from some of what you were saying. This is finally a moment where women are feeling supported and encouraged and courageous to speak out. When we've dealt with generations of gender bias and patriarchy and all this harmful stuff. And as I said, I don't think that it's gone far enough. In that more women need to feel comfortable doing that. We need to listen to more women and to do that in a thoughtful way. I think that there is another critical piece of it though, which is that we do need to figure out how to make this, it's not just a women's issue, right? We know that men make up 90% of perpetrators of sexual violence. We cannot have change unless we involve men in the conversation. And one of the conversations that we've had both at Uber and in other contexts, in corporate contexts, is how do you bring men into the conversation when there is language like "time's up" or language that may make men feel excluded from the conversation. Again, I want to be very clear that accountability is important, and there needs to be consequences, and there needs to be practices and policies in place so that when these issues do come up, that people are held accountable and that it is handled properly and that women are treated fairly. But I also think that we need to involve men in the conversation in a way that is not just about them being perpetrators. I hope that answered your question. And I don't know exactly sort of what you were referring to when you said that it's harmed women, but
Yeah, I think it goes, from a leadership perspective as a woman, it is known that a lot of men won't coach women now, right? Because they're scared to do this. And they're scared of if a woman is going to accuse them of something. And in some ways, it's hurt us because women also don't always mentor women, and now men aren't mentoring women. So there have been some, negative things that weren't meant to be from this, because it had to happen, right? It's a great movement.
Right.
So I was just curious with some place, and like within Uber, how are you working with your organization? How are you working with the women in your organization and men in your organization to make this more about like an unconscious, bias more than finger pointing to solve the problem?
yeah, and so we're doing, as I mentioned earlier, work around male allyship. We have a program that we're piloting right now called Male Champions of Change, which is just what we're talking about. As it relates to, I actually think this is a really important point to make, but as it relates to the events industry, I think that these are really hard, serious issues, right, to tackle. And I think that we should know that having a conversation is really important, and starting somewhere, and having a convening, bringing in speakers who are experts on whatever topic that may relate to this, and doing it continuously, right? Part of it is that you have to normalize talking about this stuff and confronting it. And I think, again, in this space, we often, get kind of in the narrow thinking of, we need to do sort of a development thing and succeeding in your career and sponsorship. And this stuff is actually affecting women in the workplace, right? So let's have events that talk about this. And we've done that with Phenomenal Woman. We, in our second year, hosted a benefit where I believe we called it like Me Too, What's Next? It was right after Me Too. And the whole conversation was bringing together advocates and folks from sort of the movement community with corporate leaders to say, how do we do this together, right? But like, you guys could be hosting events like that, right? It doesn't have to take somebody who's on the outside like me. And so we're doing stuff like that too, right? We launched an event series that's really focused on promoting these sorts of, I kind of categorize all of this stuff as D&I, by the way. I think it has D&I value, right? It's about how do we support women in the workplace? How do we help them to succeed? But as a one-off example, we brought in Liz Plank, who is a feminist author. She has a new book that's all about, what's it called? For the Love of Men. So it's all about male allyship. So we brought her in to have a conversation with one of our senior male leaders. And that was just one event, right? If I had all the money in the world, I'd be doing this at every single office and be doing it on a continuous basis. So my point is that, and it goes to kind of the stuff we talked about with Phenomenal Woman and ordinary people just sort of starting somewhere, right? And not thinking that you need to, and that you're responsible for solving these really hard issues overnight, and that something as small as starting a dialogue, even if you don't have a Male Champions of Change program, even if you don't quite yet know what you're doing in terms of your policies and practices, like start somewhere. And a conversation is the least that you can do, and it contributes to people feeling like they can speak up and that they can have these conversations in the workplace, right? I want to answer directly though on the question of coaching, right, and mentorship, and part of it I think is, my response is like, that's bullshit, right? Like for you to say that, I can't mentor women because they're gonna accuse me, like, don't sexually harass them. That's when that happens. That's like pretty easy, right? I think it's also about the culture shift, right? We see this especially in the VC world, where a lot of like business happens at bars, and there's the kind of concept of deals being made on the golf course, right? I think that, again, and this is how you involve men, VC see the community is dominated by men, as are most industries, that we need to understand that maybe try not to do business on the golf course. Maybe try to think about doing, providing opportunities that are more accessible for people and feel more professional, right? I think about my time in corporate law, which is, we have events that are sort of, cultivating for recruiting, and you'll do a dinner and things like that. But it is a much more formal professional environment, right? The idea that I would be doing something in a very casual nature at a bar, any of these kind of other, environments where these things may happen, just didn't happen, right? It's a different culture in Silicon Valley. But again, I think my first response is to reject it and say, like, the easy thing to do is just to not harass women and not to be an asshole, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to.
All right. So for our final question, actually one final question, because I think we're almost out of time. But what has been the best advice you have ever received?
Oh my gosh. These are like really big life questions.
Well, that's a good finale.
The best advice, I received really specific advice in like different contexts. I think the best like general advice is, on the one hand, just like keep it moving, don't worry about the haters, don't worry about the detractors, nobody has time for that, we got work to do, keep your eye on the ball, right? That's one piece of it, and the other is like enjoying the journey and the process. And as I think I mentioned earlier, I've only really come to do that, frankly, like in the last 2 or 3 years. I was always just go, and not appreciating both the process and the lessons that you learn along the way, and how important that actually is for the outcome or wherever you're trying to go. So I think it's, keep it moving, but enjoy the journey.
All right.
How cliche is that?
That's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Meena Harris, thank you very much for appearing with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you.